Committee session to order. This is a joint committee session between our Education and HHS committees. Councilmember Navarro sends her regrets, but she is not able to join us this morning. And Councilmember Rice just texted me, and he is parking, so he will be here momentarily. But why don't we go ahead and get started to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you to our very illustrious and important panel for talking to us this morning. I will establish a little bit of the context for the request for this session and then turn it over to our colleague Linda McMillan to make some opening comments and then have you guys present the presentation you have for us this morning. But shortly after taking office, I had the opportunity to attend a meeting at Health and Human Services that was chaired by Dr. Gales, and there were representatives from our school system, from our community, and representatives from Health and Human Services and representatives from law enforcement, and the subject was the issue of vaping. And I will be totally forthright and candid, this is not an issue that I had focused as much as I should have. And as the father of 4 young children, I especially should have, because I was shocked and alarmed to hear about the rates of participation among our youth here in the county. I was shocked to hear about the incidences that our law enforcement officials are trying to manage and the complexities involved with that. And I was also shocked to hear about the incidents that we've had within our own schools and the heroic effort of our school nurses and school staff that are addressing this issue. And so we thought it was important to have a joint committee session to discuss it, to shed light on it, to see what we're doing, to see what we should be doing, and also acknowledge that it's, from a regulatory and policy standpoint, somewhat complex because many of the issues here cross over to our state. And I know that my colleague, Councilmember Rice, this has been on his radar screen for quite some time, and I really do appreciate his past efforts and that of my colleagues to address this, as well as our colleagues at the state level as well. So we thought it was important to have this conversation, and I also hope that our community residents tune in and hear about the information we're going to receive today. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're disseminating information in real time to our parents and, frankly, the youth themselves, and of course, our policymakers. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember Rice, who is chair of our Education Committee, to make some opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Albornoz, and I apologize for my delay. It's interesting, though, I was watching the news, and we're seeing what's happening nationally, to where states are looking at complete bans of vaping, where you see jurisdictions that are saying that because this is so prevalent, that they're saying that we just need to stop this altogether until we can get a handle on it. You have the marketing of the companies themselves trying to address it now by saying this is not for you, and embracing the idea of an older cohort being the ones who use these particular products. It is one that still concerns me on multiple levels beyond just our youth, however, because nicotine addiction is one that's serious, one that could lead to other additional addictions as well. And so from that perspective, it's still troubling, not just for our youth, but for our community as a whole, and really is something that we need to get a handle on. A lot of people aren't familiar about the fact of nicotine poisoning and don't understand that there are actually things that can happen from an overdose of nicotine, and the amount and percentages of nicotine that are in these products and the way in which it's dispersed into the system that really doesn't necessarily signal the same thing as smoking a pack of cigarettes is troubling. And so from that perspective, it certainly is a health concern, certainly amongst our youth, but also as it progresses throughout our community as well. And so certainly something where I think that we need to pay very close attention to what's going on nationally in terms of where FDA and others are going to be on these particular products, but then also looking at what other jurisdictions are doing. And so I know I'll be traveling to the National Association of Counties in July next month, and so I'm looking forward to seeing some of the conversations there around what other jurisdictions are doing and how we can best marry what some of those recommendations may be with what we can do here in Montgomery County. So,
Thank you, Chairman Rice. Linda, did you have any opening comments before turning it over to the panel?
I just wanted to say, I think that the data has become staggering. Now, Councilmember Rice may remember back in 2014, actually, the Health and Human Services Committee had a session. At that time, we just had it on e-cigarettes. That was sort of where we were. And we had some experts come in from National Institutes of Health and to talk. And at that time, I was looking back at the old memo. There was a lot of concern, but there was a lot that was unknown. And that was kind of the discussion, which is we don't know what's in these vape cartridges. We don't know what the impact is going to be of just having nicotine delivered. There were these flavors that were being developed, like what's the impact going to be? And so here we are 5 years later, and the numbers, and particularly the numbers from 2017 to 2018, are just staggering amongst adolescent youth. And I was struck, one of the items that I included in your packet was from the University of Michigan, and it actually said, you know, increases in adolescent vaping from 2017 to 2018 were the largest ever recorded in the past 43 years for any adolescent substance use outcome in the U.S. for the survey that they've been doing. And so it's really these last couple years since certain devices have taken hold that this has really taken off. And the other, you know, thing when you look at this, in that same survey, what they found was the use of other substances either was kind of steady or declining. So it is around this issue, the increase in the use of tobacco or nicotine products is really just focused. It's all due to these vaping mechanisms, and so it is really a critical public health issue. And so I think that the panel that you have today to talk about it is going to be an important thing for the committee to hear.
Thank you, Ms. McMillan. So if the panel could introduce themselves and then walk us through the presentation, and we'll let the presentation complete, and then we'll ask questions after that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Cara Grant. I am the Health and Physical Education Curriculum Supervisor, pre-K through 12th, and I support implementation of health education curriculum in Montgomery County Public Schools.
Good morning, Jonathan Bryce, Associate Superintendent for the Office of Student and Family Support and Engagement, Montgomery County Public Schools. One of the areas of responsibility involves working with the Code of Conduct and helping to ensure that our school administrators understand the code and are able to implement effectively.
Good morning, Travis Gales, Health Officer and Chief of Public Health Services for Montgomery County and pediatrician in my past life.
Thank you. Dr. Gales.
Well, to move quickly through the presentation, Linda's comments set the stage very nicely in terms of what we'll discuss and talk about. But one of the things that I want to highlight before we jump into the statistics is a reminder that the conversation we're talking about today is grounded in a larger issue about adolescent and young adult health and well-being, particularly as it relates to mental health issues and behavioral health concerns. Because we know from a clinical standpoint, often when we see behaviors such as increased vaping use, substance use, however you define it, is typically in the context of larger issues in terms of how to cope and how to deal with stressors. It's tough being a teenager these days. And so just reminding everybody that even though we are focused on this one particular issue around vaping and e-cigarette use, it really is a subset of a larger issue in terms of how we help our adolescents and young adults make it through teenage years and be healthy, productive citizens moving into adulthood. Now, as Linda mentioned, 4 or 5 years ago, this is what we thought of in terms of vaping and e-cigarettes. This is what an e-cigarette looks like. Just as a model for those who aren't familiar, it typically has a battery power source, an atomizer that heats the liquid vial or the cartridge that contains the vaping liquid or the juuling liquid, however it's defined. Right? I heard it's also called Juul juice these days. And then there's a mouthpiece. But as we know, is that even though this is the particular original device, as we'll talk about in the context of the presentation, there are new devices that are a lot more difficult to track, that aren't quite as obvious, and that has increased the use within the adolescent population because they can hide it and be a lot more discreet in terms of using it and go undetected. One of the common perceptions, I would call it a misperception, is that particularly the way, as Councilmember Rice talked about, is how vaping liquids are portrayed. Vaping is a safer alternative to cigarette smoking. And this is an advertisement that promotes that, is vaping bad for you? It's promoted as containing no tar, having no carbon monoxide, less ingredients and particulate matter that are included in cigarettes, not producing secondhand smoke, and not having some of the other side effects such as the odor compared to cigarettes, which do have a significant amount of tar, as we don't have to litigate the past history in terms of tobacco settlements to talk about all of the different other materials that are added to cigarettes to enhance its addictive quality, and then also the potential for secondhand smoke and other secondary qualities. So leading into the discussion, historically vaping has been presented, and some would argue as a safer alternative, particularly for adults who have been long-term smokers, who are looking at a way of decreasing their dependence on nicotine. One of the unintended consequences, though, is the fact that because of that, lots of adolescents have picked up on it and use it believing that it is a safer modality than using cigarettes. Now, one of the big misconceptions is that the nicotine contained in vaping devices is much less than cigarettes. It's actually not true. There is a significant more amount of nicotine in the vaping devices, in part due to the fact that the majority of the nicotine in a cigarette is burned off in that chemical process of smoking, whereas in that nicotine is not burned off in the heating process associated with vaping devices. In fact, if you did a comparison, particularly with the juuling devices, which have a higher percentage of nicotine, you can think of it in terms of vaping and juuling devices have purer nicotine compared to cigarettes. And this schematic actually shows that if you look 1 to 2 packs of cigarettes, or equivalent, I don't smoke, so I don't know how many cigarettes are in a pack, but 20 to 40 cigarettes are equal to 1 Juul pod. And so if you also can think of it in terms of the chemical components, for example, a cigarette has, I believe, 9 micrograms of nicotine in it, but again, the smoking combustion that's associated with the smoking process burns off a significant amount of that. Conversely, when you look at a vaping liquid cartridge or a Juul device, you're having 20 times the exposure to the nicotine than if you had smoked a cigarette. So even though they are marketed as safer alternatives, they do contain a much more significant and much higher rate of content of nicotine compared to cigarettes. Now, this takes on, particularly as it relates to the juuling device, I think back to when I was a kid and we had the cigarette advertisements. Was it Joe Camel? It was sexy, appealing, it was playful to attract a younger crowd. Similarly, the juuling devices have been marketed as a sexier alternative to the e-cigarette that I showed a couple of slides ago. And this is an example of the marketing techniques that have been used to put Juul devices out. For example, this one says, Juul has finally made vaping cool. So again, think about, Councilmember Rice, you talked about now there's a movement to talk about it being for older adults. But the reality is this advertisement is geared towards younger crowds. I don't know. I think I've passed an age of being cool. So when I look at activities, I'm not looking at it to be cool. I'm looking at it for pleasure or sustainability. So when we think about this, again, this is an example of an advertisement that's geared towards that younger population. And I included a picture of these devices to the right. These are some examples of what some of the new modern vaping mechanisms and devices look like. So you can imagine if I'm sitting in a classroom and I have particularly the little device that's laying on its side, that looks like a jump drive. So it doesn't look suspicious. So if I've got that in a classroom, particularly if it's producing a clear, odorless smoke, the teacher may, or anyone else may not be aware of the student using it. You can think of it in terms of if you're at home and you happen to see your kid's computer and there's this device in the computer, it looks like a jump drive that they're using for their homework when in fact it's being charged to then be used for vaping purposes later. So one of the other areas that has come up is educating folks not only about the risk of the activity, but also the different mechanisms that are available. Now, just to look at some numbers, Linda provided a great set of articles that folks have read to talk about the numbers. One of the challenges, I will admit, is trying to get a sense of what it looks like in the county. We've had to rely on YRBS data that is a little bit limited in scope. So we have couched this in the framework of the national data, which shows much larger trends. When looking at 2017, this is data from 2017 and 2018. The percentage of 8th graders, which is significant to put in the conversation as well, because we're seeing younger kids get involved. It's not just an issue of 16 to 21-year-olds. It's going as low as 11 to 12 and 13-year-olds as well. 17% of 8th graders had vaped in the past year compared to 32% of 10th graders and 37% of 12th graders. And then we'll talk a little bit about this later as well, but when you look at the percentage of what they're vaping, it's not just nicotine, it's other substances, including marijuana, as well as flavored liquids. And then this doesn't also include the potential of what's in those other liquids. We don't know. And that has, I believe, gotten a couple of students in trouble with several recent incidents, again, that we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. One thing to point out, though, is consistent with the national trends, that percentage of 12th graders who had vaped increased 78% from 2017 to 2018, which represented a 78% increase. And then for middle schoolers, it was a 48% increase from 2017 to 2018. And national trends and our limited data that we have looked at on a local level shows that the rates are highest in white teenagers and Hispanic teenagers. And that has held true, again, across the county in our limited data. Now, some of the adolescent beliefs that go into this, again, we talked a little bit about this before, is that e-cigarettes are safe. So it's like, well, I'm not smoking cigarettes, so I'm smoking a safer alternative, so I should be fine. And so there's this belief that they cause less harm. So you see a spike in use because in their minds, they're actually using a safer alternative, particularly given how the marketing conversations are had. But then what's also concerning is that we see a high percentage of these users in high schools associated with flavors. So they taste good, they feel good. And the flavored cigarettes, back, as Linda mentioned, popping up in 2014, increased the percentage of young folks using it, so much so that the FDA stepped in at the end of last year and curbed the use of flavored liquids for these purposes. So moving forward, as we've tried to address this, one of the big issues that has been put out again is that nicotine at any level, particularly for young people, is not safe. And again, this is an example from colleagues at the Minnesota Department of Health in terms of their campaign to raise awareness that even e-cigarette use is dangerous, even though, again, it's couched as a safer alternative to cigarettes. It's still significantly dangerous due to early exposure to nicotine. And then this is a timeline that shows our regulatory actions that have been put into place to address e-cigarette use and commerce. And this is from the FDA's level of regulations. And one thing to point out is that there have been different iterations and regulations put in terms of making sure that the producers and manufacturers comply. For example, in September of last year, health warning labels were required to be put in, and then later on in the fall, that was when the FDA stepped in and inhibited flavors from being used to discourage adolescent use, and such a high percentage of adolescent use was tied to that. And we also know on a local level and a state level, the Tobacco 21 legislation passed this past legislative session that would prohibit sale of tobacco use, whether it's cigarettes or vaping materials, to those who are under the age of 21. Now, to step aside, and I, as a clinician, I get excited when we can talk science and physiology, but I promise you we won't go into great detail. Again, the meeting materials that were provided to you broke down the whole process of why we're concerned about adolescent and young adult exposure to nicotine. Contrary to what some people may think, your brain is still developing up until the age of 25. And some would argue that it still develops later on in life. But the big concerns in this early stage is the fact that your brains are constantly remodeling, reshaping, have a high degree of plasticity, and it's building and growing in those processes. So all the way through adolescence, even into early young adulthood, your brain is still forming who you are. It's creating pathways. And so one way to think about it is, it's a limited amount of space. You're obviously not growing new brain, but what you are doing is making new tracks. You're changing gray matter into white matter, and you're creating new pathways that are important to do all of the different things that your brain is required to do. And in thinking through this process and how to explain it a little bit better, I came across this cartoon that was actually designed by high school students to talk about the nicotine brain. And here's just an example of it. Walks you through all of the different concerns and aspects of nicotine development on the brain. And we'll go into more detail about these. But again, this is an example, I think, of a healthy, easy to understand tool that could be given to kids so they understand, as opposed to a lecture on neurobiology and neurophysiology, to break it down and make it more resonate more with them. But when we take a step back from a more official standpoint, the reason why we're concerned about nicotine in the brain is because nicotine receptors act in a multitude of places, particularly as it relates to synapses that involve the release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that is highly associated with pleasure pathways, and acetylcholine pathways that are integral in the communication of information, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which I'll talk about in a second. But the reason why I wanted to talk about dopamine is dopamine, when it's released, is a part of pleasure pathways. So nicotine stimulates the release of dopamine. So you see where I'm going here. You get nicotine in your system, you release dopamine, it creates a pleasurable response. Your brain likes that, your body likes that. So think about it. When you are in a state of constant remodeling and plasticity and forming these pathways, again, under the age of 25, you have the ability to create more receptors. So smoking and being exposed to nicotine, the more you're exposed to it, your body can manufacture more receptors, which again stimulates that pathway, which gets to the idea that early exposure to nicotine in this time period where your brain is still modeling and building itself increases your risk of addiction. It also increases your risk, because it's stimulating that pleasure pathway, it increases your risk of being tied to or attracted to other substances that may be more significant in terms of their response in comparison to nicotine.
Dr. Gales, can you remind us what other drugs do the same sort of thing and raise dopamine levels in the brain? Just for folks that are watching at home. So crystal meth, cocaine, crack, speed, heroin, all of those things do the same.
Not necessarily in the same way, but ultimately.
But ultimately
Pleasure, yes.
increase the dopamine levels in the brain. And so people who are seeking that sort of effect, once they're addicted to that effect, can utilize all of these other drugs to ultimately achieve that same effect of the dopamine.
That is correct.
Thank you.
So again, the second point is that not only are you increasing your addiction to nicotine, but you also increasing your risk of using other substances. And the qualitative research shows and suggests that there is a link. Early exposure to nicotine due to those similar pathways does increase your risk of using those other substances later on in life. And so the last official biology point of the day, is to talk about this area of the prefrontal cortex. So not only are we talking in the context of the pleasure pathways, but we're also talking about nicotine's activity in acetylcholine pathways, particularly in the prefrontal cortex area. The prefrontal cortex area has 9 big functions. It's your empathy chamber, insight, response flexibility, emotional regulation, body regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, fear modulation. I'd argue those are important things as an adult. I think everybody in the room would agree. They're essential to executive functioning and essential to us being adults and doing the work that we do, whether it's on a professional or personal level. It gets also to all of these other softer skills that are associated with the prefrontal cortex. In particular, relates to cognition. Here's a whole list of them. So early exposure to nicotine causes damage to the development of the prefrontal cortex. As I mentioned, your brain is remodeling and building all these pathways. Nicotine in particular disproportionately impacts the pathways that are essential to building the prefrontal cortex. So all of these things are impaired or potentially impaired on the long-term scale due to early exposure when that process is being built. And the reason why it is a little bit different in terms of when we're talking about adults using nicotine versus young people is the fact that a lot of that architecture has been built already for the adults. But with the young folks, it's still being built, and that exposure is impairing the way it's being built. And so the foundation and infrastructure could significantly be impaired and damaged, which again, chronic early exposure can cause significant long-term damage and impairing all of these different processes and emotions and qualities as an adult. Now, to turn the page to shift direction a little bit, and Linda mentioned this, is that we're not only concerned about early nicotine exposure to vaping devices, there is clear evidence to suggest that folks vaping in general are using it and vaping other substances, particularly with young people, they're vaping other substances as well. And this chart actually shows that there is a slight increase in the percentage of kids who are vaping marijuana liquids. And then that shows, if you look at the bottom chart here, it shows the percentage of 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders who were vaping marijuana and nicotine compared from 2017 to 2018. And so you see an increase across all of the categories, across all of the age groups from 2017 to 2018. And in fact, this is another educational tool that talks about how cannabis can be consumed. And you see on top, it's smoking, but then vaporizing is a big increasing in terms of popularity. And I came across this guide. Actually, I did a Google search, and you can go online and find out how to vape weed successfully. Here's a 5-step guide that breaks the process down. And again, so even before we talk about the availability of devices, how to do this is readily available. And this was just a simple search of vaping marijuana, and this is what popped up. So how to do this and the information to do this is easily accessible, even more so than actually getting the devices. So I bring this up because we had several episodes in school settings this past year. And in fact, back in October, November of last year, which was the couple of incidents that precipitated us forming a working group and meeting in February, we had 2 episodes where students lost consciousness, were administered naloxone, and the anecdotal evidence in both of those situations, actually one student had 2 episodes and the other student, both requiring naloxone administration, was that they had been smoking some type of substance with a vaping or juuling device. And we don't have any of the chemical makeup I don't think there was an analysis of the liquids, but that was concerning. So from a medical standpoint, again, even though we have clearly shown the effects of early nicotine exposure on the brain, what I'm concerned about is the fact of if you're vaping nicotine, you should not lose consciousness and require naloxone administration. We know naloxone is administered to offset the effects of opioid-related intoxication. And so the concern is that, one, that kids are vaping other liquids, and they're vaping liquids that may be laced or have other components that are concerning for opioid use. And given the regional proximity and the opioid profile of the area, we know that fentanyl has been in our region for some time now. And it's concerning that whether it's a opioid-laced liquid or some type of synthetic cannabinoid that they're vaping, is that there's potential for pretty significant side effects that we have to be aware about. And the other concern is that, again, given how, based upon when we had the meeting, it was explained how the networks, how kids get it. We've got, there was one conversation talking about how there are, trying to think of the best word here, there are point persons, even in the middle school areas, who are the sellers. They go through and they get it from someone, and then they come back and bring it to their friends. We know we can't control what's in those liquids, so imagine if one person gets a hold to something and shares it with a network of others, how impactful that could be. And since our meeting in February, we actually had another incident in March where 3 students ingested cannabinoids through a vaping device at one high school, necessitating naloxone administration. And following, fortunately, I think those students were revived successfully and received follow-up care. But we sent out a public health advisory in April, released to the public to talk about the risks. We highlighted this particular incident and do some education around the different devices, the rates that we're seeing on a national level, to try to hopefully encourage people to be a little bit more vigilant and aware of what's happening. And a couple of other steps that we've done from the public health perspective. Again, we had the first working group that was formed, as Councilmember Albornoz mentioned. It was inclusive of reps from County Council, County Executive's Office, Law Enforcement, Liquor Control, Tobacco Control, MCPS. That was quite insightful in terms of what is happening now in the county. And we have not had a follow-up meeting, in part due, I wanted to, when this was scheduled, have this meeting first. But from that meeting, we've had other groups and efforts pop out. I know that there is an effort with a student from MCPS who has led a conversation. I believe Dr. Bryce will tell more about that. But had a recent meeting to talk about education and outreach within the school setting. And so it's been encouraging that other efforts have moved forward. And as I mentioned, we sent out a public health alert on April 15th. And we have been working to look at other ways how we can increase education and outreach around the issue. And two projects that we have been working on. One is looking at how we expand SBIRT in our school health settings, particularly in the high school settings. And there's an opportunity to partner with the state on expanding that, particularly in a pilot sense, to figure out how, because we currently do SBIRT type thing. And so when I'm talking about SBIRT, this is screening and doing early intervention to assess substance use and make sure that folks are linked to the services that they need. And so that has been in the works, and we're looking to expand that and implement that at the beginning of the new school year, beyond the work that's already being done. And then just recently, yesterday, we had a conversation with a funder who's interested in doing tobacco-free work in the county, and pretty much talked about how, you know, that's important, but given our conversations around vaping, that would introduce an opportunity to design an educational outreach opportunity that can be released. We wouldn't have to wait for the school year to start on that. We could design that, working with youth in the county, and release that over the summer. And literally the meeting happened yesterday afternoon, so I don't have any more details other than to say that we're moving forward in that direction. That concludes my portion of the presentation.
Why don't we ask questions regarding that specific presentation and the health effects specifically, and then we'll shift over to hear from Dr. Bryce, because I know some of my colleagues have questions about Dr. Gales' presentation. And while it's fresh, we want to make sure we get those asked. So, Councilmember Rice.
So, Dr. Gales, one of the things, and I know we've brought this up before, but I think it's incredibly important for the folks that are watching to understand, there are other health effects beyond the nicotine that goes into any kind of e-cigarette device. Many coaches have advised their athletes not to use these products because of concerns around lung capacity and other kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the other aspects of these e-delivery devices beyond just the nicotine itself being its own inherent danger?
Sure. So as you mentioned, it can impair your respiratory capacity and impact that. Because again, you're smoking, you're inhaling something. So even though it is a pure form of nicotine, there is still particulate matter that's included in that. There's still other chemical components that are in it that can irritate the lung, that can irritate the respiratory pathways, that can not only impair one's athletic ability, but it can just impair your basic breathing function. And one of the concerns is, for example, again, when you're looking at there is a diversity in terms of things that they're vaping. So again, we can't talk strictly from the perspective if it's just vaping nicotine. So for nicotine, that can cause all those respiratory side effects. But when we know that they're vaping other substances, for example, when we're talking about synthetic cannabinoids, similar to, you may have heard of K2 and Spice, those kinds of things, if that is included in the liquids that they're doing, we know that, at least during my time in DC, we saw a significant correlation between ambulance calls during the summertime when it's hot and folks are using synthetic cannabinoids, that increase the risk of loss of consciousness and other side effects, heat exhaustion, those kinds of things. And particularly so, for example, for athletes who are active, that is a complication. And quite frankly, walking over here from Hungerford, it's hot outside. So even just walking due to the heat, that could complicate things. And I think the other layer of that is in terms of substances. For example, the anecdotal details from one of the students who did lose consciousness and required naloxone administration was also having some types of hallucination type behavior secondary to that ingestion. And again, when you don't know what the substances they're using, there's all sorts of potential side effects in terms of altered mental state. And so whether you're driving, you're interacting with other folks, you're on the job, there's a lot of other consequences that could be secondary to that dependent upon what substance you're using.
And the last point I wanted to make, just via health, is that it's interesting because even on Juul's website, where some people seem to think that Juul was created as some sort of smoking cessation device, that's not the case. It says clearly, Juul was developed as a satisfying alternative to cigarettes, something more potent, more powerful. We see it in terms of the delivery mechanism, in terms of how it can deliver nicotine. So it really is, and I just want to be very clear about this, people shouldn't compare this to Nicoderm, to nicotine patches or things like that folks used to try and wean themselves off of smoking. This was never designed as a smoking cessation device. This was designed as, from their own website, saying this was designed as an alternative, meaning that, yes, if you don't want, as you had stated before, the negative effects of smoking, the smell, the carbon monoxide, all the other additional chemicals, that those would be the things that you would benefit from using Juul. But never once does it talk about reductions. They don't have scaled down versions of their Juul pods that are a lower concentration of the nicotine. I mean, there's no step device that says, oh, this is the ones you use for the first month, and this is what you use for the second month if you want to quit. So their marketing and their sole purpose is to continue to get people addicted to sell nicotine. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear and out there for folks in terms of what their objective is. Their objective is not to make something healthier for folks. It's to get them addicted and hooked on nicotine so that they can continue to sell their products. That is what it seems from the marketing and from the evidence that's there. And just tying to that, the Juul juice that you mentioned, can you talk about nicotine salts? Because from what I understand, the nicotine salt juice is actually a product that's even more concentrated than the others that they're now marketing online and saying that this, forget about the Juul pods, buy our stuff because it's even more potent and has even more nicotine in it. I don't know if you've seen that yet or if that's come across your radar screen, but if you could talk about that as well.
Sure, I confess I'm not very familiar with the nicotine salts, but the concept is not different. That's not foreign in terms of, trying to come up with a product that actually has increased potency, within the same amount. That's not foreign to substance delivery or substance use. And again, the concern is, there has been anecdotal evidence. I will say this, and not being in defense of this thing, there's been some anecdotal evidence from some to suggest that it has been helpful in terms of weaning off smoking, but you're right, it's a completely different delivery mechanism and circuitry from those other alternatives that you mentioned. But as it relates to the nicotine salts, again, it is increasing the potency of a delivery mechanism within the same amount. And again, that's not foreign to what we do. That's been done.
Councilmember Juando.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. It's memory lane, but not a good memory for me. When I was on the Hill in 2007, we were working hard to give the FDA authority to regulate tobacco products, because at that time didn't have authority to do so. And thankfully, one of the first things President Obama signed in 2009 was a bill giving sweeping authority to the FDA to regulate tobacco products. But one of the things when I'd written the speech for my boss at the time, Senator Sherrod Brown, they were seeing Camel products that were advertising Camel number 9. It was a pink box that, based on Chanel number 9, the popular perfume. They were mailing ads, these mailers out to young women across the country, because at that time we saw increasing smoking rates in teens. And while the regulation has switched that trend and we see the decrease in smoking, here we are again with the same type of suggestive marketing. They were pink, they were flavors of the cigarettes, the candy cigarettes, they were the pink boxes. It was all the marketing was aimed at trying to get that new customer base, right? And as you've seen, less adults smoke. How are you gonna keep in business if you're Marlboro if you don't hook new people? And so here we are again, 10 plus years later, and the technology has advanced and the delivery systems have advanced, and it's really unfortunate. And the risks have gotten, the stakes have gotten higher. At that time we were arguing that we didn't want our young people to get lung cancer. We had 450,000 people a year dying from smoking-related deaths, and that has gone down. But now we're talking about not lung cancer, but we're talking about drug addiction, gateway. All these things that you just went through in your presentation, and it's just really disheartening that we're back in this place. I wanted to ask Dr. Gales a little bit about. And one more connection, and people, to Councilmember Rice's point, people should not be confused. This Juul company has received massive amounts of money from Altria, which is the parent company to all the tobacco brands, Marlboro, and so I think billions of dollars, and so it's a direct connection. This is the new strategy to hook people on a drug and get them. And again, the stakes are higher, the delivery, it's more potent. So I just think parents and everyone needs to know that this is the same strategy, just with a different mechanism. Could you talk about the flavored, well, you mentioned this, but the higher addiction rate, and do we know how much more quickly, because of the amount of nicotine, that you're able to be addicted to this type of vaping as a result of the potency and concentration? Do we have specific, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So as it relates to the flavoring component, as simplistic as it sounds, kids are drawn to it because it tastes better, it smells better. There is and I can send it to you, there's an advertisement that actually says Juuling tastes like candy. And so it's got pictures of lollipops and things like that because,
Yeah.
So they're tied to. So that is, the FDA stepped in because there was such a strong correlation to the Juul liquids that they were, or the vaping liquids that kids were using, they were all flavored. And so FDA in November said, we're going to stop that. And so flavored liquids not allowed and not allowed to be marketed towards adolescents. As it relates to how quickly the pathways happen, it is different by individual, but what I can say is, so there's some chemical evidence that can do it. There's some drug curves that talk about the pharmacokinetics behind that. But in more simplistic terms is, again, going back to the notion with young people, due to the fact that there is such a high rate of plasticity in the brain and remodeling happening, those pathways can form much faster than in adults. So we are talking about, again, it be dependent upon the individual, but significantly higher rates of being able to manufacture new receptors that, again, will stimulate the need, which is all about addiction. So, again, in that remodeling process, things happen much faster than in adulthood, which, again, predisposes the young person to becoming more addictive more quickly and establishing more of a long-term addiction because, again, they're being exposed at such an early age and are craving that and exposed to it at a much earlier starting point than if they had started using as an adult.
And that leads to my second question on the data. It seems like you kind of said this in your statement that the local data that we don't really have, it's hard to obtain, and is that mostly because we just don't know what the kids are doing? Or could you talk about why, and are there other models that you've seen of ways to get better statistics, actually what is happening here with our youth?
Sure. So a lot of youth-related information we pull from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey as our best proxy. And so within that survey, there's lots of questions asked in terms of, about what are kids doing, whether it's related to sexual activity, physical activity, substance use, and again, that's broken down by, tobacco consumption, alcohol consumption, and even within that, it's broken down by the different mechanism that folks are doing. Now, we do have that data, and
That's self-reported.
it is self-reported. And so, we can look at the percentages. I think from 2014 to 2016 was the most recent data that we had. There did actually seem to be a little bit of a decrease from the state level, and the local level. That is not consistent with the national level, given that across the board it's increasing. And so that's one of the reasons why I didn't include the local data, because again, it's 3 years old. But again, we know anecdotally as well as from the national trends that it is increasing across the board. And so again, the big challenge is it's self-related, self-reported, and it's difficult to really get a sense of it. And from it's tricky trying to marry the qualitative and the quantitative piece. So for example, there was a conversation that I had with some researchers from GW. One of the researchers actually lives in Montgomery County. Their kids went to school here. They've since graduated. And they shared with me when they went to their orientation, when their kids made to high school, the principal was very upfront that, your kids, you may feel that your kids aren't doing anything, but I'm here to tell you that most of the kids who go to school in this county will use a substance before they graduate, whether it's alcohol or smoking. And so when you hear anecdotal evidence like that, it makes it a little bit, you got to look at the data in a different way. And so we have Dr. Liu, who's our chief epidemiologist, is looking at trying to get some better data from the state to approximate it better, to be able to not only talk about the prevalence, but then also, as you know, we like geography here. So if we can find if there are particular hot spots of use throughout the county, we may be able to better target interventions to those places.
And thank you. Last thing I'll say, I'm really glad the bill passed at the state level on 21, and I think that will help with the enforcement on the sales side, hopefully a little bit, as far as really making sure that people that are selling these things, but there's always ways around that, obviously. San Francisco voted, I think, recently to ban all vaping. I think it's in process. I think it's between the Board of Supervisors and the mayor right now. I know you're not a policymaker, but you know, what do you think of that? Are we at a point, in your opinion, that it's that much of a problem that we need to halt everything? Councilmember Rice mentioned this, and kind of really figure out what our strategy is and what we're doing.
Well, I think the question, so thinking from the health perspective, I think the question is, you know, creating the environment where people understand why a ban would need to happen. And I think that, at least from the public health perspective, I think we have to up our game and do more, which is the things that we talked about in terms of doing education and outreach, to get the community to understand why that would need to happen. Because we know from a health perspective that even if you ban it, there's going to be other alternatives, and people are going to find something else or even try to get that same mechanism. And so I think what's integral to that process that needs to be married to that, if that happens, is a pretty substantial education and outreach campaign to get adults to understand it, but also really something that resonates with adolescents and young adults so they understand the risks and dangers of what they're doing, so that if that does happen, they don't go out and seek to get it other ways or seek to get other things to recreate the feelings that they had.
It's not just the man holding me back from what I want to do. This is really bad for you, and that needs to be made clear. I would agree.
So that's what we're hoping to do over the next few months.
All right. Well, thank you, and thank you for your work.
Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both chairs for convening this conversation, really important. A lot of what I wanted to address has already been addressed, but I have a few outstanding questions. Dr. Gales, you had said during one of the slides where it had equated 40 cigarettes to roughly the same amount of nicotine as one of the capsules, and yeah, there we go. So 20 to 40 cigarettes equaling 1 Juul pod, and you weren't quite sure how many cigarettes are in a pack. I will tell you, 20 cigarettes are in a pack because my mother smoked 2 packs a day and died at 53 years old of lung cancer. And so, setting that record straight, coming back to the thought that Councilmember Jawando entertained about the actual sales. Based on the presentation, 2 in 5 youth have participated, have vaped. Let's use the correct vernacular. Have vaped in the last year, and of those, 60% have used flavors. Do we have sales data about what type of pods are being sold and the breakdown in flavors and such? Is that available?
I believe it is available. We can get that data. And again, I know it'd be interesting to see how it looks, again, since FDA stepped in and said no more within that. So it's not supposed to be out there now, but we could take a look at that. And the tricky thing would be how that applies to the county. And that's, again, we'd have to rely on the national data to look at the trends and use that as a proxy.
So the data that we'd be able to get is national. There's no mechanism to request that from vendors here in the county or statewide?
We could certainly look into it. It's not already in place to do that, but we could look into how to do that.
Sure. Because I think the intent is obvious, trying to figure out who we're actually selling to, getting ahead of any possible policy decisions that would need to be made. These are some of the cornerstones of that conversation. So good, and then you referenced FDA, and so the last question I have, because I really want to get to the MCPS component on this. So the last question is, since the FDA made their pronouncement last year, what has that cooperation or coordination been like, if there has been anything? Regarding sales, regarding since they came out with the new enforcement measures, has there been anything more than just a press release from them?
Well, they've enforced it, and the companies themselves have, consistent with, when we had the tobacco litigation years ago, and the companies stepped up to talk about the risks of juuling in terms of that. And so the companies have been doing that over the last 6 months. But in addition to that, I think the big component of it is it has forced and driven a lot of conversations. So a lot of jurisdictions are now talking about taking more significant efforts to ban it or ban it or regulate it in some way. After our meeting in February, I actually went out and spent some time with the Chicago Department of Health on a number of public health issues, looking at what they were doing, but one of them was meeting with their team around to learn about their tobacco work. And now that tobacco work has moved into the space of e-cigarette and vaping. So I think one of the big side effects of that ruling back in November has been it's forced a lot of people to have that conversation. So last year at this time, there are a couple of articles out talking about maybe e-cigarette use and vaping is dangerous and risky, maybe for kids. But once the information came out to talk about the preponderance of the link between the flavors and adolescent use, that conversation took off. And so now we have that ban in place. And now that has raised, again, going back to the need to educate the public, that has raised a level of awareness where it's on everyone's radar. We're having this conversation today as an example of that.
Excellent, thank you. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. I just had two quick questions, and then I also want to hear very much from our colleagues in MCPS. But with regards to another corresponding issue that is of grave concern to all of us is the mental health of our youth in particular. And from a biological standpoint, does the use of these products exasperate or is in any way connected to, is it making the problem even worse? Or is there a direct correlation between some of the mental health challenges we're all concerned about and that any relation to these products?
Well, I think the big correlation is the fact that, again, going back to, I think that vaping use or substance use of any capacity at the adolescent, young adult level is a manifestation of something upstream. And I think the way that you really, truly get to the use of these devices, because the reality is, from an adolescent standpoint, I'm drawn to these things because I'm having these other stressors, I'm having these other issues. That's the real root cause, but those things predispose me to take higher risk, whether it's, higher risk physical activity, sexual activity, substance use. And to me as a clinician, that is really the heart of the matter in terms of really addressing those root causes. And I think that will then ultimately have a significant impact in terms of decreasing the use of substances or these other activities. And so I applaud both committees' interest and efforts in terms of raising awareness in that level, because I think that's really the heart of the matter. And I think that, these behaviors are manifestations of those larger issues, whether we're talking about how to cope, bullying exposure, interpersonal violence, the stressors of academic success, trying to fit in, home life, all of those things. And unfortunately, adolescents and young adults don't always have healthy, functional, constructive venues to be able to work through those things. And so typically what happens is, again, I can think from my clinical practice, a parent comes in, they're not coming in saying, my kid is stressed out or I'm concerned my kid's depressed. They're saying, well, I found a beer can in their room or I found a cigarette. Can you talk to them about that? And in reality, it's now certainly once they start using the substances, there is increased risk of becoming addicted. It can modify the behavior and worsen it. In terms of, we know that alcohol is a behavior modifier. And can lead to other things. But again, I think part of the conversation that can't be missed in this is really, truly making sure we expand and further create the infrastructure to address those upstream issues that then I think will have a significant impact on the behaviors that we're talking about today.
Okay, and these products are odorless, and beyond the identification of the cartridges themselves, I would assume there is no way that parents can easily or readily identify that their child is doing these products. So, okay, just want to confirm that. And then the actual cartridges themselves, there was a recent story about one exploded as somebody was using it. From a public health standpoint, are we starting to see more evidence of the actual vehicle that people are using to use these products? Is that becoming an issue?
You're certainly starting to see more anecdotal evidence of that. I don't think there's a quantitative study to quantify how often that's happening, but certainly you're starting to hear reports, because part of it is also as you raise awareness. I know we've talked about this with MCPS in terms of helping teachers be able to identify these devices. So I think because it's now, there's a heightened awareness to it, there's more reports of those types of activities happening.
That's the perfect transition. So, Dr. Bryce, if you could give an overview on what you're seeing and what MCPS is doing to tackle this issue.
All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to come and to collaborate with HHS. The issue of vaping in MCPS is one in which we take very seriously. We certainly do not believe that it is appropriate for any of our young people to be involved with vaping, whether it be tobacco, marijuana, or other substances. And so certainly there is an education component which Dr. Grant is going to speak to as we think about our health curriculum. What I'm going to speak to are two other areas of really support. One is our overall plan to support all students. It's our initiative that we call Be Well 365, an initiative that really wants all schools to focus on 6 core areas: mental and emotional health, establishing culturally responsive relationships, trauma-informed care, restorative justice and restorative practices, as well as physical health and well-being. And then just making sure that all of our young people are engaged in these positive mental and emotional health activities. And so what we'll be doing on Wednesday, June 26th, is sharing with all of our administrators another overview of the Be Well 365 initiative, but also asking them to make sure, as they're working with their instructional leadership teams over the summer, that they're putting in place programs that make sure that they're touching on all of these areas for all students. All right? So having said that, I would also draw people's attention to our audience that may be watching. If you go to the MCPS website and type in Be Well 365 and pull up those resources, you'll be able to see a host of links and programs by school, as well as staff that are able to provide support if parents believe that there are issues that they want to talk about with school staff. Having said that, one of the things that we do every year is produce Students' Rights and Responsibility, as well as a Student Code of Conduct. The Student Code of Conduct that specifically speaks to the use of tobacco products or possession of tobacco products, as well as drugs and alcohol, is included in your packet. I'll mention a couple of issues. Number one, for this past year, preliminary data indicate that we have approximately a little over 300 instances where students have received a consequence, an out-of-school suspension or higher for either possession or use of drugs or other substances. We know that some of them are vapes. We actually do not have a breakdown. What was vapes versus what may have been other substances. I can tell you that it is the 3rd or 4th highest category of offenses for which young people have received that type of consequence. So it is certainly something that we are taking very seriously. Having said that, I also want to I think it's important that we put this in context. MCPS, as we all know, has 163,000 students. For the given year, this past school year, we believe that we are going to have approximately 3,500 out-of-school suspensions. All right, so that is 3,500 incidents where students may have received that consequence. Some number of those may be for students that have done something once or twice, so they may be repeated numbers within that. The reason why I give that context is because when we look at that 300 plus number, we recognize that this is an issue. we recognize the importance of making sure that we approach this from a health perspective and not from a punitive perspective. It is important that all of our young people are afforded access and opportunity to curriculum that help them to understand and to make good decisions. And that's part of the health curriculum that is included for all of our students, K to 12. And so Dr. Grant will mention that. The other thing I would mention is that we also recognize the importance of elevating awareness of the dangers of the use of vapes, Juuls, and other products. And in last year's Code of Conduct, we included language related to that as a footnote. For the upcoming school year, we have moved from a footnote to including that language right in the matrix as it relates to tobacco, as it relates to drugs and controlled substances, because we think that in some cases, the awareness on the part of students, a higher level of awareness on the part of students, that this is something that if we find has consequences, may deter some students from the use of these products while they're in school, while we also recognize that providing them with education and curriculum and teachers working through this issue will provide them with hopefully rationale for why they shouldn't do this in the first place, whether it is in school or out of school. A lot of the conversation that Dr. Gales had about vapes touched on this point that I think we need to take a moment and really hone in on, which is the fact that these products are smokeless, odorless, and minuscule, which means that if an administrator or a staff member are walking down the halls of one of our schools and they are very well not able to see, very well likely not able to see a young person participating in an activity where they are using these devices. And so it does require a level of situational awareness, that they are really watching students, that our staff members, our teachers, and other professionals are watching what students do. But just the minuscule nature of the device, as well as the odorlessness and the smokelessness, makes it a really difficult task for our thousands of teachers to watch every student at every moment. In the incidents where we've had students that have required have required nursing support, we are very thankful, again, for our health professionals in place in our schools, able to respond. They followed the protocol. They have administered aid as well as called 911 to get ambulance support and to transport the young people. But this is something that is going to require community, student, all of our folks in the community to be aware of the dangers of using any of these devices with any of these liquids, and then hopefully that awareness will help to drive down the usage. Last point, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grant. So there was a conversation about whether or not there's a way to get additional data, and there actually is. So MCPS is investigating whether or not we are going to establish our own survey of students. We know that neighboring jurisdictions, Fairfax County actually administers a yearly survey to their students. And that is something under the Be Well 365 initiative that we are investigating. And so we are investigating whether or not we can add on to the state student survey that is administered, or whether we would have to do something on our own. And that would hopefully be able to provide us with additional information about student participation and usage with these products, and give us a greater sense of where we need to be. I did say one more thing, and so it's actually one more
I'm
thing.
used to it.
Right. And then lastly, what's so great about MCPS is student voice and our young people that are really actively engaged in issues that they see are important to themselves and to their peers. And so today in our audience, we do have one of our students, a rising senior, Louis Schreiber, who is working, has put together a work group to really look at issues related to the use of vaping, Juuls, these other instruments in schools. And so I just want to take a moment and thank him for his leadership on this effort, because when students are involved, what we recognize is that students talking to students carries just a little bit more weight. I know Dr. Gales earlier said that he's sort of past the cool stage. I think for most of us as administrators, we've sort of passed that cool stage. And so when students are able to speak with a sense of authority and are empowered to speak with their peers, we know that goes a long way. And so I'd just like to thank him for his leadership. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grant. The last thing is, and I mentioned this, but I'm just going to reiterate it. This cannot be a situation where we're looking to punish students. This has to be treated both as a health issue, as an issue where we need to provide them with curriculum and training and teaching, but also get them support if we find that young people are involved in these substances, and only typically as a last resort, or where we see that they're actually in possession of these things and using them for distribution purposes, do we think the out-of-school suspension and expulsion route is appropriate. But even in some of those cases, we need to additionally get them support through our colleagues at HHS as well as community-based partners. So with that, for information about our curriculum and what we're teaching in our classrooms, I turn it over to Dr. Grant.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to take a step back and frame what health education is like in Montgomery County Public Schools, but I also really want to acknowledge that this is a real public health issue, and we also feel that we're equal partners in this. Student education is just one prong of a comprehensive approach that needs to be taken, and evidence of this is in this room, that we're all equal stakeholders in this, and we all play a role, from teaching our littlest of people to teaching the parents of those people what our students are facing today. So health education in Montgomery County Public Schools extends from pre-K through high school, and our students that are 21 are non-diploma bound students. And the goal of that is really to give them access and information to everything from mental and emotional health, nutrition and fitness, alcohol, tobacco and other drugs, family life, human sexuality, safety, injury prevention, as well as disease prevention and control. What we do is we also marry those state mandates with national standards that have health literacy skills. And those are more of the fluid skills that you want a well-functioning person to use. Interpersonal communication, advocacy, like our student member here, advocating for something that they feel is an important health issue, making our environment and our county a better place to live and grow. As well as understanding like peer influences and risk factors, why things are happening to them in the world they are, and how to make good decisions based on goal-setting models. So with that, now I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. With alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, we have content standards that start in grade 1 and extend through high school that are specific to tobacco and nicotine. When you talk about the curriculum, it has to be age appropriate. You know, I'm a mother of 4 sons, and my littlest is 8. And when, you look at the medicines in your home, some of them, if they're on the counter, can look like the candy that we don't purchase, right, that they get from elsewhere, right? So helping students identify that, how do I know what's candy versus how do I know what's a medicine in my home, is just equally as important to when we get to first grade, what is tobacco, what is nicotine, and what are the harmful effects? Like in first grade, we teach them that it is harmful to your body. And then it elevates to, like in 3rd grade, identifying physical consequences of what that could be, identifying the forms of tobacco and nicotine. This goes all the way up from knowing the marketing ploys that people are using to get you to purchase these, that have extended from when we would have a tobacco-focused program with the Joe Camel ads and the bandwagon approach, or have someone famous purchasing it, or even just looking at movies or music videos or YouTube, and how the peers that they have, even though they're social media peers, are using that to influence the decisions that they're making to be like those people they want to be like. And unpacking that, because what we know is that our students are going to take risks. We can't stop them from taking risks, but what we can do is provide education so that they're taking healthy risks. You know, that they're trying out for the sports team, or they're taking advantage of recreation department activities after school, instead of taking risks of trying juuling or trying marijuana or binge drinking or things like that. So we're trying to steer them to taking the healthy risks of more challenging classes and confronting bullying, as opposed to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, being a bully themselves on social media or in school. So with that, what we do is that we have that continued age appropriateness from how tobacco and nicotine are harmful to, comparing and contrasting the short and long-term effects on the body system, knowing what the media influences are, the peer influences are. What if your parent or guardian in your house is the influence? Like, how do you combat that as an individual? So taking a step back to understand that we're all coming from different places and we have different challenges, and how do we know that although my mom, dad, or parent or guardian isn't making the right decision, how can I make the right decision myself? That kind of gives a high-level overview of our curriculum. And then what we do to make it better. Education is a constant cycle of growth and development. So I can tell you, I just finished my doctorate. I was joking with my sister that I haven't stopped going to school, and I really didn't love school growing up in Montgomery County. I was more of the sports advocate person. So being a constant learner is a constant growth cycle. And in our curriculum cycle, what we strive to do is make sure that we're aligning ourselves with subject matter experts across all the content subjects that we teach. The mental and emotional health. I mean, we have SAMHSA in our backyard. We've got NIH. We have CDC. We have the Montgomery County Collaboration Council. So leveraging the relationships with HHS, bringing in behavior substance abuse counselors to speak to our teachers and provide with trends. We've had the police department come in to provide professional development on specific trends that they're seeing with arrests and information like that. Within the county itself, we have systems and structures that we're getting stakeholder input as well from the continuum of people that we're serving and supporting in our district. We have a system-wide wellness council that's been in place for the past 5 years and continues to grow with collaboration. We have members from Kaiser Permanente, as well as Health and Human Services, to transgender health members, as well as student advocates and parents. We're active participants in the state and local school health council. That's where we get a lot of data that shows us information like what Dr. Gales presented today, that the drug hit influence on the body system is like larger than smoking a cigarette. So you're going to get more of a high or a hit from a Juul than you would a cigarette, which is kind of like the dopamine is a little bit more exciting and enticing. And if you don't know that, then you can't educate students about that, and they're doing that. If we don't have the education ourselves, then we're not going to be able to impart that to our teachers, to then share that with our students and move that forward. One of the last structures we have in place is our Curriculum Advisory Committee for Health Education, and that has student members, parents, health educators, Health and Human Services, and the like. And what we do through that forum is review materials for use with our students to say, what is age appropriateness of it? Is this a good resource that we can put into place to make sure our students are getting the best information possible? I can tell you in 2014, when we last updated the health education framework, we did add e-cigarettes explicitly. The good thing about the way the state frames what needs to be taught in health education is it is alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, which lets us keep up with the trends from whether it's bath salts, K2 spice, to now the vaping and the juuling. And as soon as we're getting resources from the state, as soon as we're getting resources from our subject matter experts, whatever the content area, we're able to vet those and then push whether it's a teacher resource on Julian to be shared or it's a student resource on Julian to add to the online curriculum to support students with education. I have to say that we're continually growing and there's always opportunity to move forward, and we're always open to feedback. I think that's what makes it better, is not feeling that we're the best, but we're trying to be the best in whatever we do, and we're trying to make sure our students have the access to the most current, relevant, research-based data and information as well. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Dr. Bryce and Dr. Grant. I didn't know how recent that was, but that's exciting. And good to see you in this capacity. Dr. Bryce, I'm really happy to hear, and I was reviewing last night the kind of continuum and the fact that MCPS, consistent with policy in other areas, is viewing this as a public health, as a health issue. And while there obviously have to be policies related to how you interact and deal with students when things are happening in real time, that this is on the level 1, level 2 side, teacher interaction. It's not, you're trying to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I read, trying to kind of de-emphasize out of school time and treat this more as a opportunity to get help. But you do have it, in this level 1, level 2, which is written apology, talk with school counselor, detention, or community service, peer mediation, temporary removal from class, as far as kind of the consequences if someone's caught with one of these devices. And could you just talk about that, how that's being implemented and how you're using that? And while it's great to say this is a public health thing, what are we actually doing in the schools? Walk me through what a teacher would do, and I'll pause there.
Yeah. So typically what would happen is a staff member, teacher, paraprofessional, administrator is alerted that an individual is in possession of a vaping device. And so they would ask the student or probably walk the student to the office to speak to their assistant principal. Their assistant principal would say, "Oh, Jonathan, glad to see you. Why are you here?" Find out, "Oh, I had this device. What's in the device? Oh, it's tobacco." All right. And so the conversation between the assistant principal, most likely, and the student would be about, "Well, why do you have that? Oh, are you using tobacco?" "Yeah, I use it all, every once in a while, but never in school." And then typically what would occur is that there would be a referral made to some sort of community-based program, right? So the assistant principal might include the nurse and say, "I want you to speak to the nurse to find out, are there any programs you can go so that you can stop smoking," things like that. That's if we really know that the device is only being used for tobacco. If, however, we think that the device has another substance, one that might be legal, one that, and the way we would typically find that out is if we look at the student and the nurse does a preliminary assessment. We might find the student seems to be somewhat disoriented. The student may be have red eyes or things like that. Then at some point, the conversation would move from what you see here around tobacco, which is a level 1 or level 2 consequence, up to drugs and controlled substances, which is really a level 2 through 5. Depending on what else we find as that school administrator talks to the student. But first and foremost, and you even see, it talks about making the referral to Montgomery County Health and Human Services or community provider or an MCPS program, because we think it is critical that we get students help. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that we don't have individuals that think that they are going to be able to walk into our schools and to distribute to other individuals, and that there won't be a consequence. We need to be very clear about that.
So, it would be great to see and or think about if you said the nurse may or may not, for example, be engaged. And I could imagine at 207 schools, right, that you could have vastly different, and obviously we're probably thinking mostly about our high schools, but probably our middle schools too, unfortunately, and I'd love to know if you are seeing it there. You could have a principal or assistant principal or administrator that deals with this differently, and though we're all consistently saying we want to make sure it's a mental health, it's a health thing, I think we should automatically engage a nurse and or counselor, and you know, I would think that should be the standard policy. And I'm not, maybe I misheard you, but it sounded like it could be some variation.
Yeah, so let me give you clarity. So there is the ability on the part of school administrators to work within level 1 or level 2, and the consequences are slightly different, but still within what we would consider to be an acceptable bounds. The reason why the nurse may or may not get involved is after the administrator speaks with the student, if the student appears to be in any way under the influence, disoriented, and is showing signs that there might be something afoot, then the administrator would call in the nurse to have the nurse do a preliminary assessment to determine, are we seeing elevated vital signs and things like that, which would then move it from merely tobacco to drugs and other substances, increase the range of potential consequences, as well as ensure that the parents are alerted.
Okay,
So that's the difference.
And in the referral to community services, to the point Dr. Gales made, that community service would encapsulate mental health, because obviously a lot of times if kids are doing this, it's because of something else, as you've stated. So, okay. And then one other question. You mentioned the 3,500 out-of-school suspensions. I'm assuming that's a downward trend, I would hope.
So it is we are probably right where we were last year, and we had a few more. We had fewer students last year, so we're probably a slight downward trend, but that data is still preliminary. It's preliminary until our Office of Shared Accountability reviews the data, submits it to MSDE. MSDE gives it back to us, the Maryland State Department of Education. And so we'll have final numbers sometime this summer, but I do think it's a slight decrease over where we were in terms of the number of incidents last year. And overall, really good for a district with 207 schools, 163,000 students.
And roughly, I know you probably don't have this back of hand, but how many of those related to substance abuse and these types of issues?
So the number I gave, which is approximately 300 of the out-of-school suspensions, were related to drug/substance abuse, and that's a preliminary number, as I mentioned, until Shared Accountability works with the Maryland State Department of Education to finalize our discipline submission.
And I think the survey is a great idea, because I'm assuming you guys will be looking at, is this in certain parts of the county? Is this with certain types of students? Well, and looking at to try to find the right supports and see where the trends are.
Absolutely, and we think it's time. We think that as a county, what the YRBS gives us, which occurs every 2 years, it really supports the national data set. And of course, you can break it down by state and by county. But what we're really looking for is being able to be able to fine tune a survey to get more immediate feedback on a yearly basis from our young people.
Thank you very much.
I'll just note that our school nurse program is stretched and compromised as it is. And so we're adding another literally life or death component to their job description when we're struggling to meet the demands as they are. And so, Ms. McMillan, I know we've talked about our school nurse program, and this obviously came up during the budget process, but yet another example of why it's so critically important that we provide more capacity within our schools in the upcoming year. And this, to me, just underscores the urgency to do that as soon as possible.
Absolutely. I just cannot underestimate the importance of the health techs that we have, the nurses that supervise them, the work that MCPS along with DHHS really does to provide support every day in our schools. Every day in our schools, a young person, might get hurt on the playground or has a seizure because they have an undiagnosed medical condition. And so anything that the council can do to increase our ability to provide nursing services, I know both of our agencies would be greatly appreciative of that.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Grant and Dr. Bryce. Regarding the MCPS regulation that we have in our packet stating alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, just to be clear that vaping and this liquid nicotine does fall under that regulation.
Oh, yes, sir.
Good, okay. And wanting to just continue a little bit more on Councilmember Jawando's question regarding the incidents and the surveys. I share his interest in that data. Can you, because I'm not on the Education and Culture Committee, I wasn't aware that this type of survey is conducted. And can you just share with me the other type of information that you currently capture within that survey?
Right, so it's the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's not a MCPS survey.
Okay.
And so it's a national survey.
That I'm familiar. I thought it was an MCPS.
No, but what MCPS is interested in doing is putting our own survey for students that would cover a range of these social, emotional, as well as potential substance use issues, culture and climate issues. And so what the decision point is around whether or not we are going to connect to the state of Maryland survey that has just been implemented, or whether or not we're going to do something separate and apart.
Thank you for that. And while I know it's not created just yet and you're thinking it through, can you share publicly some of the items that you would wish to include in that's not data that's not currently captured?
So I would think that we would want to model this survey to cover certainly issues related to substance use, but also maybe issues related to after-school activities, engagement in the type of activities that students want to see in schools, and things like that.
Okay, thank you very much. And then my last question, comment goes back to Dr. Gales, actually. And in the context of this entire conversation, it seems that Joe Camel seems so quaint, given today's climate, media and otherwise. But as we're talking about the odorlessness and the smokelessness of vaping, that is not what I'm familiar with, because when I walk around, I'll see people who vaped and I see the trail of smoke and I can smell kind of the flavor. So just explain to me some of the technical aspects that we're talking about versus the reality that I and so many other people see.
Sure. I think the biggest technical aspect is the difference in terms of the mechanism of delivery.
Okay.
And so, again, if you're an adult, you are legally able to purchase the device and smoke. So, I think there is less need to be discreet in terms of how you do it. And so, for example, going back to, since I have this up here, this device here is not something that it's probably something that you are familiar with seeing, or some version of that. The difference with adolescents and young adults is the fact that, one, they can't have that legally, and these other devices, such as those on the right-hand side and even those in the cigarette box here, or you can see a little bit better once that's gone. But those devices are able to do the same thing, but are a lot more discreet. So the new popular one is the one that looks like a jump drive that you can charge in your computer. And, if you think about it in the context of a school setting, everybody has them. So you're not thinking something, whether it's in school or you're a parent at home, it's not uncommon that you would see something like that. So that's what's different in terms of how people are using that. And we know, again, the adolescents, because they know that they aren't legally supposed to have them, are using those more discreet methods more often. And in fact, most of those, the last point is, most of those more discreet options are tied to the juuling devices, which have more nicotine in their liquid.
Yeah, and I would like to add, as part of a professional development from the State Health Symposium last summer, there was a national expert that shared and had students come in and talk about their experiences. And they were saying, yeah, all you do is you just inhale, you put your shirt up, and you can hide it in class. And so, like, students are sharing these techniques to hide it. And with the Juul, it's a very small puff of mist or smoke or whatever you're going to call it, whereas opposed to the other ones, I feel like it's the glamorized look. They look like a dragon with all this smoke coming, billowing around, and so that's the not discreet way. But students and YouTube and other ways, they're just really trying to be a little bit very savvy, like Dr. Gale said, but they're coming up with ways on how to, and it's like how we used to pass notes in class, right? Except this time it's an illegal issue.
So the big puffs of smoke is the legal way where one does not have to be discreet, essentially.
For the legal age.
Right, legal, and everything that encompasses.
And those devices, I mean, I always see folks, like, as I'm driving, you pull up to a red stop sign, or a red light, and you see somebody with the device is rather large, right? What we're talking about are really small devices. And if you've ever seen a USB drive that looks decorative, I've seen some that are like turtles or other like little small, they're that small, they take them out and they actually insert the cartridge right into the device. And so the question then becomes, if you're walking down the hall, if you're sitting in the classroom, if you're in the back of the classroom, teachers up front at the board, and it doesn't produce that smoke or that odor, it is very conceivable that the teacher is going to miss that. And that's something that makes this more detrimental to classroom environments and school environments, just because it's something that you won't see unless you are actively looking for, and even then, you still might miss it.
And on top of everything else, our instructors are doing, that's just one more thing, and having it be untraceable.
Correct.
Makes it an almost impossible task, sure. And last question here for Dr. Gales. Have there been complaints within the county from individuals complaining about, have people complained about vaping on county facilities?
Not out of the ordinary. I think most of the conversations as relates to public spaces are due to, smoking in general and some of the other legislative pieces that have been enacted over the past session, but not as it relates to vaping.
Okay. And a clarifying question, does vaping fall under the smoking statutes that we have?
Yes, it does.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Councilmember Rice.
He was absorbing it.
put you to sleep.
He was absorbing it all in and processing. It was good. I was seeing the wheels turning. So, Dr. Bryce, my question for you is that because you opened your comments with this in terms of suspensions and other penalties associated with students regarding drugs as a whole, right? And we need to be very clear, nicotine's a drug, marijuana's a drug. They may come under different controlled substance regulations at the federal level, but we treat them all as drugs. And so from that perspective, are the penalties in MCPS code the same between a person who's caught with a vaping mechanism and a person who's caught with a small amount of marijuana?
It depends. All right, and so that is the sort of vagaries of implementing this in 207 schools with all of our administrators. So in the hypothetical that you gave, which is small amount of marijuana, vaping device, I guess the question, even though you said in the vaping device it's marijuana,
No, it'd be nicotine.
well, see, and that's the issue. We don't necessarily know what's in the vaping device unless the student is exhibiting signs that they may be under the influence of a substance. And then that is confirmed preliminarily by the nurse. And so if, marijuana, we're right here with drugs and controlled substances. It depends on, is this your first time? Did you have a one marijuana cigarette? Or do you have enough that looks like you might be sharing with other people for money or just because you're friendly? And that would lead probably to a much more significant consequence, which would be a level 4, level 5.
Okay.
All right? But the just in possession of nicotine, we're going to treat that as tobacco, and it's not going to rise to the level of consequence that we would for something that we know to be marijuana.
So here's what, again, and this is just one council member's advice. I think that because the state of Maryland has decriminalized marijuana, so anything under 10 grams is non-arrestable. You can receive a citation for it, but you cannot be arrested. Because of that, and because of what I've spent a lot of time with our school resource officers at a multitude of schools during this past school year, and paid very close attention to the prevalence of the vaping devices that were confiscated. School resource officers and your school security are doing a great job, and also for marijuana possession, and some that have both. I think that they need to be treated as the same when it comes to our students, again, under the gram limit, which anyone can easily determine, or of course, if they're, baggied up for individual distribution or sale, whatever the case may be. And let me tell you the reason why, and the reason why I think that there's a next step to what it is that we want to do, which ties into what you said, which I completely agree with, about not trying to penalize our kids, because these are, again, drug addictions. Whether it's nicotine addiction, which I said via Dr. Gales, and we had that conversation, or whether it's marijuana addiction, it's still a drug addiction. And what we've done in this county is try to steer people away from our criminal justice system and put them into a treatment model. What I would like to see is MCPS doing something more of what our model is with the drug court, to where the students actually are faced with significant suspension or something like that, versus you go into a health program where you learn about the health effects and the hazards of what it is that's being done. And then upon completion, you don't have the mark on your record, and so it's an incentive for the student, because it gives them the ability to not even have that as a mark on their record as a whole, regardless of what the penalty may be. It's, again, what we do for adults in our criminal justice system. And so I think moving into that direction of we're being more supportive of exactly what you said. You said it. I just think we need to actually bring it into actual being in terms of creating a program like this. And I promise you, I know you know, there are plenty of kids who would be able to fill the seats in a program like this, right? And it would run the gamut. I mean, there's so many things that qualify that our kids, unfortunately, are experimenting with, whether it's prescription drugs, whatever the case may be. We educate kids on them from the very beginning. And it starts, fortunately, now in elementary school, as you know. We originally had started seeing it more in middle schools being the trend, but I can tell you, my daughter, who's in 7th grade, and we've seen it in elementary schools, let alone prevalence in middle schools. And so from that perspective, it's one in which I think it would really serve us to make sure that we try and look at a mechanism of doing something like that. So that, again, just one council member's suggestion, but I think it would carry us a long way when it comes to really educating our kids even more so. We can do a great job on the front end, but some of them are not going to listen. And the reality is that when social media is all out there saying, oh, don't believe what you hear in the classroom, and that's what you're challenged with, right, doctor, is that, you can teach in a class, this is dangerous, but if you have 50 million YouTube videos out there and Instagram posts and everything else saying, nah, this is good, and look at us, we're having fun, and it's all, that's what they're listening to. Trust me, there are people out there who still believe the world is flat because it's on YouTube. So, I know I'm going to get Twitter things from the flat Earth people now, but
Do they use Twitter?
yeah, I think they do use Twitter. But it's going to be one of those where, again, I really think that that's the great direction for us to head in, and really providing that additional resource for these students to really help to educate them about the dangers of the things that they're undertaking. And so maybe in partnership with HHS, with our school nurses after we get them, ramped up in terms of capacity, this will be something that I think could be landmark for us and really could put us on a different platform when it comes to what it is that we're doing with our kids. So.
Absolutely, something that I certainly will share back with our Chief Academic Officer.
Councilmember Jawando.
And I appreciate Councilmember Rice bringing that up. And when I was going with my questions on the suspensions, I'm kind of going down the same alley. I'm glad he was much more direct with it. He's the chairman, so I let him. That's why he's the chairman. If you have a population of 300 students too, that have been suspended, that's a great place to start. For example, I mean, that's a manageable number, and I would agree that, and I would be interested to see the data of what those students look like and where they are, and because obviously this is in a larger environment of disproportionate arrests based on uses of drug for adults, right? And so we don't want to be mirroring that in the school system, and I hope we're not when you guys analyze that data. But either way, we also want to be consistent with restorative justice technique, all the other things you're doing, and consistent with our drug court model to have a path that is totally focused on rehabilitation and treatment, particularly for our young people. And so I couldn't agree more. And you have two council members that, so if we don't have that type of thing, I think we need to figure out how to do it, because this is only going to rise. Kids are doing it. We all know kids are going to experiment. Some are going to get hooked. Some are going to not. And we're going to need to be there with not just a referral, because a referral is only as good as if it followed up on. And so, and it could be we could work with our contractors to make sure it's a guaranteed referral program, like you have to mandatory referral. That might be a way to do it and have a public-private partnership, but we need to figure out something in that area. So we'd want to work with you on that for sure.
So we don't have public safety here because we wanted to focus on this as a public health issue and the education standpoint. But the fact remains, kids are accessing and buying these products, and the question is, how are they getting them? Yeah. Especially if it's under 18 now, and even if we move on to 21. And so I know in that work group, I learned from talking to law enforcement officials that while many of the students are unfortunately purchasing them from retail stores, and there is a regulatory aspect of that and a punitive aspect of that we have to go through, but many of the students were also purchasing them online, and which made it even more, it makes it obviously even more difficult to regulate, because all you have to do is check a box that says you're over the age of 18, and there's no way of verifying that. And then to make it even more complicated, some of the students were sophisticated enough to have them delivered to a neighbor's house who they knew was on vacation or traveled a lot for their job, or had them delivered during a time that they were likely to be home but the neighbor wasn't. And so I do think, while we don't have officials here who are in a position to address that specific element of this, and that would be appropriate to have our colleagues from public safety as part of that conversation, I do think that needs to be another phase of this discussion, and what we can do to beef up, to strengthen policies and procedures from that standpoint as well. Ms. McMillan, you want to say
I would
something?
just say the HHS and Public Safety Committee, when you had discussions about the mental health court and the drug court, had asked for a future session to talk about similar models in the juvenile system. So I think maybe we could even broaden that and kind of talk about the whole restorative justice for youth.
That would be great. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. This is very useful information. I'll close with this. Dr. Gales, I assume you don't have a marketing budget. But with regards to, you're using all the tools you have in your toolbox from a public awareness standpoint, but there are limitations to that. Could you talk a little bit about how you discussed within your presentation current ways that we're trying to alert the public, but if you could, borrowing a phrase from one of our colleagues, wave your magic wand from a marketing and public education standpoint. What could you talk about? What best practices that are out there to educate our community at large to this crisis?
Sure, thank you. I'll use my pen as my magic.
Yeah.
I think that, fortunately, there are lots of good models out there in other jurisdictions who have extensive campaigns, so we wouldn't have to, start from scratch. As I said, I have spent some time learning about the Chicago model. As you mentioned, San Francisco is looking at bans, so there's lots of opportunities out there. I think that, an educational outreach campaign needs to be multifaceted, hitting different groups. Certainly, part of that would be potentially bringing in a consultant to help us figure out the right messaging based upon our demographics here, how to tell that story to young people, to older people, to those who are smokers, to non-smokers, to make that case of why it's important in a public health issue. And then in terms of operationalizing that, to be perfectly candid, I think the old way of PI work was, and not to say that these are bad things, or, you make some bus ads, put a print ad out there, that's fine, but, particularly given not only have we seen a sophistication in the mechanisms, there also needs to be a sophistication in the message. So utilizing and leveraging technology to be able to tell that story and make that case. So magic wand would say probably, utilizing some type of consultant resources to study those best practices from other jurisdictions, as well as, potentially staff members, whether it's brokers or something like that, to help deliver that message in different ways. And I think that, again, now that we've had this meeting, we would likely bring together that working group again and bring all the folks back to the table, including law enforcement and regulatory services, to talk about some of the things that you mentioned. Because I think that would also help inform other areas of what needs to happen in terms of the outreach piece.
Given the crossover with policy at the state level, I'd encourage us to include our colleagues from the delegation and our legislature to join the work group as well, because the policies here are obviously complex. And I would even invite somebody from our federal delegation to be there as well. So as we're wrapping up here, if you could give a message to parents, Dr. Gales, what would that message be?
Stay vigilant. Check in on your kids. Because again, I think from, I'll put my pediatrician hat on. It's, yes, vaping is a significant issue, but really ultimately it's how are your kids doing? And, are they okay? So, just continuing to check in and see how they're doing, and to be present and aware of what's happening in their lives. Because again, I think that, whether we're talking about vaping or substance use in other areas or other types of behaviors, they are just manifestations of other issues that are happening in their lives. So, keep an eye out on them, as cliche as that sounds.
Great, I appreciate that. Well, thank you all very much for coming and providing this wealth of knowledge and information. There's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done here. This is going to have to be a very community-wide effort, because there is no one agency that's in a position to tackle this on their own. So we appreciate all your efforts and look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you. Thanks, guys.